Hi, I'm Alexis, a volunteer producer with Fort Collins Public Access Network, FCPAN. We're an all-volunteer, nonprofit, public access television network that broadcasts on Comcast Channel 97. We're proud to have brought you locally produced, non-commercial programming since 2004. We teach you how to shoot, edit, and produce your own shows about things you're passionate about. Local history is one thing I'm passionate about, and that's why, as a volunteer producer, I'm making this video to share some information with you. It's 2014, the sesquicentennial of the founding of Fort Collins, and I'm going to take you on a short journey of the early history of this town and of some historical buildings that you might walk past every day. When's the last time you looked up and noticed their beautiful architecture? Do you know who built them and why? Do you know what businesses have been there? And what about those ghost stories I've heard about? There are many colorful legends how the Cache-la-Poudre River running past Fort Collins got its name. The most popular is that in the 1820s, fur traders buried gunpowder during a snowstorm to lighten their load. It's probably a myth, however, but the most plausible one comes from a report from the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, who stated these fur traders regularly buried their gunpowder or cached their powder along the trade route for future access. In 1862, a Kansas Civil War cavalry regiment built Camp Collins to protect travelers and settlers along the Colorado branch of the Overland Trail that came through this area. When this camp was flooded out, a permanent fort was built in June of 1864, authorized by Colonel William O. Collins, who named it Fort Collins. It was at the north end of today's Old Town, and the rest, they say, is history. 150 years of Fort Collins history, that is. After the fort was decommissioned, more settlers began to arrive. They built a school, churches, hotels, businesses, an agricultural colony, and even an agricultural college. The visionary founding fathers constructed a number of elegant homes and commercial buildings in Fort Collins, many built from local sandstone quarries. They also developed thriving sugar beet and lamb feeding industries. In the early days, it was difficult for Fort Collins to grow because it was so isolated. But in 1877, the Colorado Central Railroad decided to run a rail line from Golden, Colorado, all the way to Wyoming. The Fort Collins Board of Trustees did not want this train line to bypass Fort Collins, so they enacted an ordinance which gave right-of-way for the train north to south along Mason Street in perpetuity. That means forever. As you can see today, the train traffic is a little different than it was in the 1800s, but love it or hate it, the train down Mason Street is here to stay. Since 1864, Fort Collins has grown, prospered, and became known as a choice city. In recent times, Fort Collins has been touted as the best place to live in America, best place to retire, a platinum bicycle-friendly community, and the Napa Valley of beer, among many things. As Fort Collins grew, the residents thought this town was as cosmopolitan as any other town, and they wanted an opera house, just like the one in Leadville and Central City. So in 1880, several businessmen got together and built this large building to house the opera house and also some other businesses.
In the late 1870s and the early 1800s, a lot of wooden buildings in the downtown, and there was a real bad fire in the Welch Block, as it was called, at College and Mountain. Several business people, Welch, who owned that business, and J. Boughton, who had part of the property, and Franklin Avery, and there's a list of about 8 or 10 business people said, you know, we want Fort Collins to be known as a cultured town, you know, not a frontier town. So we're going to build an opera house, because Central City had an opera house, Leadville had an opera house. And so they pooled their properties and their money, and they built this 3-story opera house that ran from the corner of Mountain and College, about a third of the block north.
It was 3 stories high and ran 200 feet along College Avenue, which made it the largest structure at that time. It was called the Opera House Block. In addition to the Opera Hall and the 2nd and 3rd floors, the building housed the First National Bank, the Welch Dry Goods Store, and the Windsor Hotel. The Opera Hall was the center of entertainment for Fort Collins and hosted musical acts, plays, political rallies, and community meetings. But strangely enough, it never hosted a real opera, only the operetta, The Mikado. The hall seated 1,000 people. However, the entire population of Fort Collins at the time was only 1,300 people. Even though the Opera Block appears to be in the middle of a city block, don't let the word block confuse you. Today, we consider a city block the distance between 2 cross streets, but back then, a block was considered a building that had a block of businesses in it. In 1917, the front of the Opera building was completely remodeled, and the 2nd floor theater became a dance hall. And then, in the early 1990s, the 2nd and 3rd floors were demolished, and the interior was remodeled, reminiscent of a Victorian train station. Today, the Opera Galleria is home to offices upstairs and businesses and restaurants downstairs. And also in the winter, it's home to the farmers market down here on the atrium floor among these beautiful trees. Some people say they've seen a specter or ghost in the Opera Galleria building. They say it's Ed Trimble, who's one of the founding fathers of the building, and he worked there until the day he died. They hear his cane clicking on the cobblestones in the alleyway, and they call him the ghost of Trimble Court. Here we are in Trimble Court. I wonder if we'll find him. Let's go look.
The Opera Galleria appears to have some of the most active paranormal goings-on that any place in Old Town. Psychics that I've taken in there have told me that there were so many spirits in the Opera Galleria. Both asked if there is possibly a portal in this building that would be causing so many spirits to want to come to this location. They're not necessarily historical ghosts. They could be very contemporary from people who have died just recently. There's also a report of a little dog, a little beagle dog that appears as a ghost.
In 1881, Franklin Avery opened the First National Bank building in the Opera Block building across the street on College Avenue. A few years later, he found himself embroiled in what's called the Battle of the Banks, where all of the bankers in town were building bigger and better buildings in order to get more business and more customers. Not to be left out, Franklin Avery partnered with Montezuma Fuller, the first bona fide architect in town, and built this wonderful Avery Block building. Then he moved his bank to this location.
In the mid-1890s, the town growth had kind of slowed down because of you had the Great Depression of 1893, and so the town was just beginning to come back, and so Avery decided he would move into this new, bigger building and, you know, show that the town did have prosperity. Small town still, silver, basically agricultural. The town growth really boomed right after the turn of the 20th century.
This building represents the height of Victorian architecture at the time. Notice the intricately carved stonework all along the top. And have you ever seen the stone cherubs? There's one over here and one over there. And how about the beautiful Romanesque arch over the front door and the magnificent stone lion? I wonder if they put the stone lion there to protect the money. In its heyday, the Avery Block building was called the Grande Dame of Fort Collins, but over time it eventually degraded, and In 2012, it went through a major restoration to bring it back to its former glory.
Franklin Avery was a surveyor who came to Colorado from New York in 1870 to plat the Union colony in Greeley. 2 years later, he was hired to plat Fort Collins and created the wide streets that still exist today. It's been said Avery wanted the streets to be wide enough so you could turn around a team of horses pulling a wagon without having to back them up. Whatever his motives, today Fort Collins benefits from his wide streets. Franklin Avery opened the First National Bank in the Opera Building in 1881. It was a beautiful structure made out of brick and native red sandstone that came from nearby Stout, Colorado, a camp for stone quarry workers. Unfortunately, you can't find it on the map anymore because it no longer exists. Why? Because in 1949, Stout was abandoned and the valley was flooded in order to create Horsetooth Reservoir as part of the Colorado Big Thompson project.
The Avery Block is a significant downtown building. It's kind of like a flagship building that kind of anchors between the old town and the new town. They're at College, Mountain, and Linden, or now Linden being the old town square. Franklin Avery was the man who basically laid out our town, laid the streets out, named the streets, started the First National Bank, actually in the Opera Galleria when it was built, or the Opera House, and then built his building in the mid-1890s. Montezuma Fuller had come out here, and it was actually when he got here, he was a carpenter. But in those days, to build a structure as a carpenter, you also had to draw the plans for the building, unless somebody took them out of they did have books that had plans of buildings, and so he was the person who designed the major parts of the Avery Block. When the building was built, the red sandstone came out of the quarries out west of town, and the carving on the bank facade, you have in the frieze band, you have little cherub faces, and then over the door you have a beautiful carved stone lion. And because our sandstone in this area is much harder than the sandstone in the Denver area, the features are still nice and crisp and sharp. And you look at some of the buildings in Denver and they've kind of just eroded away.
Franklin had a daughter named Meddy. Meddy married an attorney named Newton Croce. Now Newton had a suite in the Avery Block on the second floor for his law offices. Newton had a client named William Ryan in 1904. William was going through a divorce, and Newton Croce defended him. William wasn't happy with the outcome of the divorce. He had to pay a little bit more alimony than he was happy with, and he stewed on it for a little while, and then he decided he was going to take it out on his attorney. So in the middle of the afternoon, in August of 1904, Mr. Ryan enters the Avery Block. He goes up the stairs. He looks to his left where Newton Croce's law offices were, and there's a little bit of conversation between the two. Ryan shoots Newton Croce and runs out of the building down the stairs, where he's apprehended by a crowd and taken to the jail on Walnut Street. Newton Croce's colleague, a man named Jefferson McAnally, held Newton Croce in his arms while Newton Croce took his last breath there, right in the stairwell of the Avery Block. It is reported that Newton Croce's spirit can still be seen in that stairwell.
In the 1800s, Fort Collins was growing and needed more formal government offices. It also needed to protect its citizens and businesses from fire in a town full of wooden buildings. So they built this firehouse. It also housed City Hall. It might seem odd to have both the firehouse and the City Hall in the same building, but at the time it was a very common practice. Having City Hall at the firehouse also meant having a jail and a drunk tank that's now the back room of Happy Lucky's Tea House. And here you can see where one prisoner almost hacked his way out of jail.
They established a hook and ladder company in 1880 using horse-drawn ladder wagons. The horses were kept on premises so they could be hooked up quickly in case of fire. But because there was no city water system, fires had to be fought with bucket brigades. In 1882, a water system with fire hydrants was finally established in town, allowing for more efficient firefighting. The fire department volunteers were called to action from a bell tower with a stationary bell that was rung by a rope from below. Since the downtown area wasn't that big, the bell could be heard for quite a distance. This firehouse served Fort Collins from 1882 to 1973 when it was sold and became a hardware store.
The fire station was downstairs and upstairs were the city offices. So it was the firehouse and the city hall. And in 1897, then they built on to the east side of it and expanded the size of the city hall and the fire department. And the fire pole is still on the inside of that 1890s edition. The tower was reconstructed in the early 1980s. The city had changed it early 20th century into a modern fire department with fire trucks, and they had to knock out the big arch and put in a garage door. And so when it was restored, they restored the larger arch.
Some people have reported seeing a specter up in the bell tower window. It's thought it is an old firefighter who was killed in the line of duty who watches over the city to keep it safe.
Clifford Carpenter was the fire captain at that firehouse until the 1960s. Unfortunately, Clifford died in a fire at the corner of Oak and College in the 1960s. While a fire fell on him, while a crowd watched, and unfortunately he did perish in that fire. And Clifford was very proud of that firehouse. He would let the public come in, he'd give CPR lessons, and he was very proud of his firemen. And some people think that Clifford still keeps watch. One of the most popular rumors of who the firehouse is haunted by is a man named James Howe. James came to Fort Collins in 1881. He was a very well-respected businessman. Things started to go downhill for him right about 1886. And in 1888, James actually killed his wife, Ava, right there on Walnut Street. He was jailed, not at that location, but when it was a firehouse, James was one of the first hose cart boys, and that was his place of employment. So when he was hung and he died, his body was cut down with the noose still around his neck, and he was taken to the firehouse. His body was laid there. And it is rumored that his spirit still walks this location near the firehouse with the noose around his neck. He's appeared on the spiral staircase just east of the firehouse.
And if you think you've seen this firehouse building somewhere else, that's because there's some pretty much like it in Disneyland.
A gentleman named Harper Goff grew up in Fort Collins. His family owned one of the local newspapers. In the 1950s, he went to work for Walt Disney, developing a new theme park in California named Disneyland. Walt Disney was fascinated with Harper's photos of his hometown and his charming historic buildings and train depot. Using them as inspiration, Walt Disney created Disneyland's Main Street, USA.
So the next time you're in Disneyland walking down Main Street, USA, just remember that the inspiration for the feel and look of it came from right here in Fort Collins, Colorado. Down the street from the firehouse, is an imposing three-story Victorian brick building built in 1882 by Abner Loomis and Charles Andrews to house the Poudre Valley Bank. The upper floors were used for offices and also a meeting room for the Masons.
With upper bay windows, a steep-hipped roof tower, and an ornate bracketed cornice. The ornate building featured wood and brass furnishings as well as a burglar-proof steel vault.
The builders of the building were Abner Loomis and Charles Andrews, so officially it's the Loomis and Andrews block. But William Stover and Charles Sheldon started the bank that moved into there, which was the Poudre Valley Bank, which became Poudre Valley National Bank. And that was built in a couple of stages in the 1880s. But it would be contemporary with the original part of the firehouse.
The upper floors housed various offices and a meeting space for the Masonic Lodge. In 1910, the building became the Linden Hotel and was host to many legendary characters such as Wild West showman Frank Miller.
Frank Miller he had been in different Wild West shows. He had had a gas station down at the corner of College Pine and Walnut and sold sharpshooter gas. But he was a trick roper and a trick shot, and kind of fell on hard times, and his foster son was killed in a truck accident just before the end of World War II. And according to the story, he painted this scene, a mountain scene, up on the wall, on the plaster, and that was to pay, some stories say to pay his bar bill, except the city was dry at the time. So most people say, you know, it was to pay his rent. When they were putting in Nature's Own, they wanted to create this new arch, and they were going to take out where that painting was. So they cut in around it, put in a metal frame, and lifted it out. And now they moved it down lower, and it's over in the back northwest corner of the big room.
After years of neglect, however, the hotel was condemned in 1984, but was fortunately saved from the wrecking ball. It was restored and opened to retail tenants and offices in 1994.
The Linden Hotel, or as it also is called, the Loomis and Andrews Block, because it was originally a bank, is reportedly also very haunted. It is supposedly haunted by a man named Frank Miller Jr. Frank Miller Jr. grew up in Fort Collins. His father owned the Miller Block, and as an adult, Frank Miller Jr. started his own Wild West show. He had a ranch up the Poudre Canyon where he would give shows up there, and he spent a lot of time at the Linden Hotel. Supposedly there was a bar in the Linden Hotel, and it was called the Bloody Bucket Saloon, and it was on the north end. This is a rumor that Frank Miller Jr. spent a lot of time at the Bloody Bucket, and to pay for his bar bill, he painted a beautiful painting that is now in the northwest corner of Nature's Own. Folks have often reported that they can see the image or the apparition of Frank Miller Jr. In the Linden Hotel. I myself have had an experience on Walnut Street. I was in one of the businesses there. One of the psychics identified that we were being watched by Frank Miller Jr. And when I went to look behind my shoulder to see where she was pointing, some curtains moved up and down like this, as if to say, I'm here. So to me, Frank Miller Jr. is like royalty in Fort Collins, so I was very honored to meet him, and I let him know that.
In 1882, Frank Miller came to Fort Collins from the mining town of Black Hawk. He ran a successful liquor business and built this building to house his saloon and a dry goods store called the Fair Store.
Frank Miller was a Danish immigrant who had come to the United States and eventually ended up in the Gilpin County Mining District, worked as a miner and decided he couldn't make any money as a miner, so he opened a saloon and mined the miners. And then he bought this property in the middle of Fort Collins in the 1880s as the town was kind of beginning to grow. And then in the late 1880s he proposed to build this big building, and the newspaper said there's no way he's going to do this thing that he's planning because it's just too big and too expensive. And the Miller Block, very similar to the Avery Block with the big pieces of sandstone, and except using a couple different colors, the red sandstone and the buff colored sandstone, and then brick also. He built this two-story, very substantial business block, but it was actually the north two-thirds of the building. The name F. Miller, 1888 up there, actually sat on the corner of the building, and then it took him like 2 or 3 years to get enough money to add the south part of the building. And you can see it on the back. You can see where the bricks don't quite line up, and there's like a seam. And there's a door on the back that comes out of the second floor onto the space where you walk between the buildings. And there was a 2-story outhouse back there, and that was the door to the upper outhouse. It's still got a lot of the original wooden ceilings above the first floor, and the inside, if you go up on the second floor, there's this great big beam that runs up, kind of arches, and it's called a house truss, and it supports the building. And it's I think the first and only time that was used in Fort Collins. But it's on the inside, and it's real hard to see because it was offices upstairs, and for many years it was a 3-2 bar. He had a liquor business in there until 1896, and then the town went dry. So
the Women's Temperance Union lobbied for a law to be passed that made it illegal to manufacture, store, transport, and sell alcohol. The motion passed, and prohibition was installed. After that, Frank Miller had to close his saloon, but the dry goods store continued for another 52 years. And so did prohibition. It lasted all the way to 1969, even after Congress repealed it in 1933.
His liquor business went out, but there was the fair store was in the north half of the building, which was like a general merchandise store. Fair stores were kind of like a chain store all around the United States. They were kind of like the Walmarts of the early days. But his son, the younger Frank, they have different middle initials, worked for the fair store, and because it was his father's building, he set up a shooting range in the basement and practiced with rifles and pistols and got to be a crack shot, and eventually started performing. And during our semi-centennial in 1914, he and some of his people put on a big, it was like a 3-day rodeo out at Prospect Park, which would be west of Sheldon Lake. One of the tricks that he did was his wife Peggy, he'd stand her off about 10 feet away, and she'd put a big piece of chalk in her mouth, and then he'd pace off about 10 paces, and then he'd turn around and they'd blindfold him, and he'd pull out his pistol and shoot the chalk out of her mouth. They later divorced. And his rope tricks, he supposedly, he went, at one point he was with the 101 Ranch show out of Oklahoma, and he supposedly learned some of his rope tricks from Will Rogers.
I can understand tearing down a hotel to build another hotel, but moving a hotel and renaming it several times? That's the history of the Northern Hotel right here at College and Linden.
The beginning of the hotel business in Fort Collins is attributed to a lady named Auntie Stone in 1866. She rented sleeping space in her cabin on Jefferson Street. This cabin was moved and attached to an existing structure at the southeast corner of Mason and Mountain in 1873 and was called the Agricultural Hotel. In 1877, the agricultural hotel was moved to the corner of College and Walnut Street and was renamed the Commercial Hotel.
In the 1880s, they jacked it up, put wheels and axles underneath the agricultural hotel and took it over and put it down on the corner there of Walnut and College. In the later 1880s, they started tearing down parts of the wooden hotel and building in brick and stone and renamed it the Commercial. The Commercial was a three-story building that fronted on College, and eventually they added the wing along Walnut Street. And then right after the turn of the 20th century, some local business people bought it and says, we're going to modernize it. And so they took all the nice decorative features off of it of Victorian architecture and turned it into just this plain flat iron building. And then in 1924 they added a fourth floor. And these hotels down in that area, there was, you know, as you came off of College and headed west on LaPorte Avenue, there was the depot for the Colorado and Southern Railroad, and when you went down Pine Street, there was a depot for the Union Pacific. And so these hotels, part of the thing they did was serve the traveling public that came through on, you know, came in on the train.
The Northern Hotel had a beautiful tile floor, a stained glass ceiling,
And the hotel also had an impressive stained glass dome in a banquet room so large that it could seat 50 people and an orchestra to entertain them. The hotel was so impressive that in 1905, a newspaper called it the leader in first-class hotels in the state of Colorado.
When the local business people took over the hotel, one of the things they did as part of the remodel, creating the Northern out of the Commercial, was they put in this enormous stained glass dome in the dining room. And after it was put in and it was being used, they realized that they'd created a problem, because you could sit in the back corner of the room, you know, like some guy could meet with his mistress and be whispering sweet nothings, and the people on the other side of the room, it was a perfect acoustical dome. So sometime in the early 1930s, when Ace Gillette bought the Northern, he lowered the ceiling covered over the dome and made it into Ace Gillette's Cafe, and people forgot about it. And it was in the 1970s, there were some electricians doing some work down there, and they poked up through this acoustical tile ceiling, and they went back to the owner and said, "Do you realize you have this beautiful stained glass dome?" And he said, "No." So that's when it was uncovered again. But you can stand in there and you can illustrate that by, you know, standing on one side and just talking very low, and somebody on the other side can hear you perfectly.
During the 1920s, the Northern Hotel was again remodeled and a fourth story was added. In 1930, it was remodeled again and an Art Deco facade was added. Because the Northern Hotel was very close to the train depot, it was very busy and hosted many travelers, including John Wayne, Olivia de Havilland, and Vincent Price. However, as automobile travel became more popular than train travel in the 1950s, the Northern Hotel's guest business gradually declined. The hotel was purchased in 1972 and was again renovated. Unfortunately, in 1975, a devastating fire severely damaged the hotel's upper floors. Because of lack of funds to rebuild, the hotel operations ceased. However, businesses continued on the first floor. After the fire, workers discovered the stained glass dome above the false ceiling, uncovered it, and today it appears in a first-floor business.
Some people feel that seniors aren't the only residents here in the Northern Hotel. They talk about seeing a specter or a ghost of a weeping woman who's pining for her dead child, and they see her or hear her walking through the hotel at night.
Well, from my experience, the Northern Hotel is very active as far as paranormal. I've had lots of experiences with spirits at this location, and so have guests on our tours. The most common reports of ghosts at the Northern are a woman, I call her the Weeping Woman. She has, folks around, business owners and residents often hear a woman crying. Supposedly it's a woman who stayed at the hotel when it was the commercial hotel in the 1890s. I did some research and I found it was about 1894, 1896, and a woman was staying with her daughter. The daughter did fall out of a second floor window of the commercial hotel, and quite possibly the weeping that business owners and residents here could be this woman still crying over her daughter. Also, a man in a top hat and a suit is seen there almost regularly. I've had visitors on my tour actually report back to me that they have seen a ghostly man walking towards them while on the tour in a top hat and a suit. There's a lot of ghostly activity at the Northern Hotel.
In the year 2000, the Northern Hotel was extensively renovated and the upper floors were converted to affordable housing for seniors. On the first floor, there are still retail shops and restaurants today. So that's the end of my tour today. I hope you've learned a few things about the early history of Fort Collins and some of these historic buildings. So if you're new to town, have never been to Fort Collins, or have lived here your whole life, it soon becomes obvious that this place is special. So the next time that you are in Old Town Fort Collins, don't forget to look up and enjoy the beauty and heritage of these wonderful old buildings.